Welcome, everyone.
Okay, I was just going to say hello, everybody. I'm going to hand you over to the wonderful Vivian. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks, Kate. Welcome, everyone. I'll do the introduction first. It's almost, yes, it's 6 o'clock now, so let's start. So welcome to this evening's Women in Journalism Masterclass, which is everything you need to know about data journalism. My name's Vivian Francis. I'm on the WIDGE committee. I'm also a senior lecturer at London College of Communication, and I'll be chairing tonight's session. So delivering tonight's masterclass is Juliet Ferguson. Juliet's worked for The Telegraph, for the BBC. She started out at BBC World Service and ended up at the BBC's investigative strand Panorama. She currently splits her time between Europe Investigative Cooperative, Investigate Europe, where she works as a journalist, and she also works at the British Centre for Investigative Journalism, where she organises training. So the format of the session, Juliet will deliver her presentation for around 40 to 45 minutes, and then we will open up to questions. If you can put your questions in the chat, and then we can go through them. So welcome and thank you, Juliet. I'll hand over to you.
Thank you, Kate and Vivian, and great to see so many people here this evening. I was worried everyone would have Zoom fatigue by now, but I'm glad you haven't. So hopefully I'll make it a worthwhile hour session for you. So as Vivian said, I work partly at the Centre for Investigative Journalism, where I learnt data journalism skills and a little bit of history. It was brought over from the US around 2005, 2007, where my boss, who set up the centre, was a pioneer of it and was very impressed with what was going on in the States and thought this is definitely something we should be doing in the UK. For the first few classes, we flew over an expert trainer, and it was tumbleweed. There was just no interest whatsoever. But we stuck with it, and I don't know what happened. Various stars aligned, be it openness of data, freedom of information, a few data-driven stories hit the headlines, but suddenly we were running 2, 3, 4 courses a year and had waiting lists for them. So then we started to look for trainers in-house, and a whole group of us upped our skills, started to work on stories, started to use data. So that's my data history. And I currently work for Investigate Europe, where I've worked on some data stories, which I'll show you, and happy to answer any questions that I can about our approach and how we work across borders and different teams and different problems of creating data sets and interpreting them, finding out what they're telling us. So I'm just going to share my screen because I have put together a presentation. Okay, so I hope everybody can see that. If anyone shouts, if there's a problem, shout. If silence, I'll assume everything is okay. So, right, okay. Well, I'll start off why we're all here on Zoom rather than in a classroom setting or where we previously were, socializing, speaking, exchanging ideas, and it's COVID. And COVID, if any story, illustrates data's importance and how it's used to try and make sense and trying to get a handle on what's going on and what's been happening, then there couldn't be a more perfect example than the pandemic. I mean, you think back to the early days and we were poring over these charts. I certainly was comparing countries, comparing death rates, who's gone into lockdown. It's all data driven. And that's natural because data journalism has its roots in the sciences. It came into journalism through social science, but it's using the techniques that scientists use to find out patterns, to model, to find out what's going on and to try and make sense of the world. So very much a data story, and I'll risk switching over to a tab because even though we're 2 years into the pandemic, it's still very much, okay, maybe I won't. I was going to show you, we've got the link. I don't want to risk losing everything, but there's a link to the Financial Times, which is a whole page of current stories about COVID, and it's vaccines, it's anti-vaxxers, it's how the economies have suffered. It's totally data. So it helps us try and grasp something that would otherwise be quite unfathomable and try and help us make sense of this world that we're living in now. So from COVID to cholera. I don't know if anyone's familiar with the John Snow pub in Soho, named after a doctor who used to live in the area back in the mid 19th century. Around the 1850s, there were a lot of cholera outbreaks in Soho, as well as other parts of the UK, but the density of the population in Soho made it particularly vulnerable to these outbreaks. Now, back in this time, the received wisdom was that cholera outbreaks, as with any illnesses that they believed, were caused by miasma. They were transmitted through the air. That was how you caught diseases. If you wanted to stop diseases, you needed fresh air, go to the country cures. There was no indication that it might be another cause, perhaps transmitted through the water. But Dr. John Snow had a hunch that cholera particularly could be water transmissible. Now, he worked with the local vicar, partly to win the confidence of the people in this area. He went house to house and he asked people where they took their water. Which well do you draw your water from? And he collected the data. And I'm using this example because this was way before computers, way before Excel. He had a notebook and a pen and he spoke to people. And he put his theory to the test. Where are the cases of cholera? Where are the worst outbreaks? And what's near there? What are their water sources? And he identified a well in the Broad Street area that there were clusters of cases of cholera around there. So he went to the authorities and said, you know, guys, I know you think it's miasma, but look what's happening. I believe it's water-based. And he did manage to make his case to get them to close this well. And the cases did go down. It took him a while to actually, for his theory to become more mainstream and more broadly accepted. But he didn't stop at just this particular outbreak because there were other outbreaks elsewhere. And again, he used this mapping process and found out that 2 water companies were dumping raw sewage into the Thames where they were then taking water from. So by mapping, by looking for clusters, but also looking for outliers, because he did find a few cases where people were far from the well and yet they still had cholera. And by speaking to them and asking them, there was one case that he found that the people thought there was better quality. It tasted better at the Broad Street well. So they'd been bypassing their nearest well and going to Broad Street. Also around Brewer Street, there seem to be far fewer cases. And there's a clue in the name there, left over from history. Brewer Street, there was a brewery. They didn't drink water so much, they drank the beer. So by mapping this, by speaking to people, by finding out what was going on, winning trust, he managed to create this map, this cholera map, and he saved lives by closing this well down. He stopped people drinking and lives were saved. And it was the first steps on the path to understanding how disease could be transmitted through water. And if you want to read more, I'd highly recommend the Ghost Map. It's a very enjoyable read. It's not just from a data journalism perspective, but from journalism and the importance of questioning what's going on and speaking to people and working with people like the vicar in this case, who are trusted in the community, that can be a way in and a way of winning people over and explaining what you're doing. And it's a thoroughly good read that I would recommend. And going back even further in history, this combines a leak and data. And again, it's something that I think is quite relevant when we're talking about poverty and how figures that are the official figures can be misleading and ways of finding out what's really going on. This is the oldest example that we found so far from the Manchester Guardian. And what it does, it lists the number of children in schools receiving free education. But the official data was actually much lower than the leaked data. So when the official data came out, it was X amount of children are receiving free education, but obviously somebody thought this is wrong. I need to give the correct information to the Guardian, leaked the data, and they found out the total, far from being 8,000, was actually 25,000. Free education, it's a bit like free school meals, it equals poverty. These are people that are below a certain level of income and therefore they're entitled to a free education. So that's leaks and data. And both of these examples, they're done with, I'd say a pen and paper, but it could quite possibly have been a quill and paper. So you can use data and you can understand data without it being technical. You don't have to be a whiz at computers and a whiz at Excel. Obviously, the more sophisticated it becomes, it helps, but at a very basic level, you can find things out just with a few simple commands. So it's nothing to be scared of. So, okay, that was my little background to it. Now I'm going to come on to some recent Investigate Europe stories. So the way we work as a cooperative, we will look at stories for 3 months. So we will go in quite deep and find out what's going on, the structures in place, the players, the legislation, what groups, organisations, in this particular case, the EU, say they're doing, but what they're actually doing. And very often what they're actually doing is in direct contradiction to what they say they're doing. So last summer, we had a look at various climate targets. And we had a series of 3. I've got 2 that I'm going to show you here. And I haven't gone into so much detail in either of these, but I am happy to answer questions if you have any. I have gone into more detail about a slightly simpler story that we did. So hopefully that will explain the process and the methodology. For Europe in the gas trap. Now, Europe's got ambitious climate goals, and in order to meet them, certain things have to be met and certain things have to be delivered and certain things have not to be done. And in terms of things not being done, new gas projects worth, I'm hiding my numbers there, worth 104 million is not one of the things you should be doing. LNG terminal capacity, 54% is not something you should be doing. Pipelines was a slightly different one, because could pipelines be used for other forms of renewable energy? For the most part, we found they probably couldn't. So even though we've got ambitious climate targets, we're still investing 104 billion in gas projects. Now, what's nice about this is it gives you a number, it gives you an idea of the scale of it. And you can say you're investing, you know it's bad, you know you shouldn't be investing so much, but if you've got this 104 billion, you get an idea of just how off track many of these projects are. For that extent, it's got to be seen as more of a transition for that amount of money for new projects. It's not converting what's currently there. It's not investing in things that maybe carbon capture storage or things that could help with the transition or could take carbon out of the air. These are new gas projects. So it highlights the contradiction between the targets that have been set and what's actually being done. And the other nice thing about these, it gives, if you use social media and tweet and want to do outreach, it gives people something to hang on to. It's this, these numbers have been used a lot when we promote our work, and they've been used a lot by other media outlets who then quote us. The numbers, I think, they just give something to grip on. They give an idea of the scale. You can do your interviews separately. You can ask your other questions. But if you've got something like that, 104 billion, you immediately kind of know what you're dealing with here. It sets out that this is probably a problem. This is something we should be concerned about if we've got targets. How do the two meet? And the other one that we did along the same lines was subsidies. Now, this is a slightly more tricky one when it comes to collecting data, and I will explain why, especially if you're working across different countries. But again, we had the number. Climate goals, the fossil fuel sector is being subsidised by more than 137 billion, and more than, it's deliberately vague. And there's a reason it's deliberately vague, and it's very much on the conservative side. So I will now explain the reason. So particularly when you're working across different countries, not all data is equal. There's some very good reasons for this, and there's some that can be deliberately misleading. So even within the UK, you've got different public bodies, you've got councils, you've got different regions. Not everybody collects things in the same way. Not everybody categorises things in the same way. There's no reason for people to do that. A colleague recently did some freedom of information requests to universities, and some will do it by academic year, some will do it by calendar year, and others might do it by tax year. So you've immediately got 3 different ways. Now, when you're doing a freedom of information request, if you're asking for data, it's always worth thinking about being very specific about timeframes, because you may know what you want and you might think a year is 1st of January to 31st of December, but it's not always collected that way, and it's not always given that way. So think very carefully what it is you're asking for. Categorization. Again, it can be a simple case of one authority calling something one thing and another one calling it something else. So there might not be anything disingenuous about it. It might just be a perfectly valid reason, just the language behind it. But if you're thinking of collecting a data set or comparing data, it's always worth seeing if you're comparing like for like, if what one thing you assume is, it's actually the same in what you're comparing it to. And I'll explain that a little bit more in the context of the climate stories. Misleading categorization. When is a tax break a subsidy? When is a subsidy a fuel allowance? When is it to help people out of poverty? When is it to help the fossil fuel industry? Now, sometimes there can be good reasons, like with the helping people, giving money to people to stop fuel poverty, but at the same time that's supporting the fossil fuel industry. Or it could be a tax break for airlines. So we found out later when we were doing a story on railways that airlines have a much better tax deal on fuel than the railways do. So there's subsidies on kerosene, and there's historic reasons for that. But it does mean that when you're categorizing, sometimes they're called things deliberately to be hidden. Sometimes they have been given very obtuse categorization, and you kind of try and figure out what you're actually saying here. I mean, sometimes it will just, if it's to relieve poverty, it's a fuel allowance. So you're always trying to think about, is it a subsidy? Do I count it? Do I not? And if we're in any doubt, we tend to err on the side of caution and don't include it. So that figure that I gave you, it's a very conservative figure. If we were to be ruthless and include every single little thing that we could possibly class as a subsidy, it would be much, much higher. Also, the vagueness when we say by more than. The 137 billion is the number that we're absolutely sure, if we're challenged on, we can say it's this, it's this, it's this. We know that's a subsidy. We've got the explanation here. Anything else that's vaguer, we've left out. So it's always that kind of balancing act by what you include and what you it's an investment of time as well. How much effort do you look trying to unravel what's going on, and especially if things are deliberately hidden or maybe not made as clear as perhaps they could or should be. Availability. I mean, again, this is another thing. It varies a lot between countries, but it also varies in the UK. If you're doing Freedom of Information Acts or asking information from different councils, some are really good. Some will get back to you with the data. And others will just not even answer your replies at all. Of course, you should challenge it, but then if you have a deadline, if you have a story to get out, I always feel like we're kind of letting them off the hook, that punishing the ones that are good with their data, even if there's a story that might be negative to them, the fact that they've shared this data and they've given it to us, it's good for us and it's good for them because it shows that they're transparent. But then those that don't, that just drag their feet and miss the deadline or will put up blocks, they're missed from the story. So I think it's always important to say that, to say you didn't receive data from whichever public bodies, or they didn't respond to the Freedom of Information request. So you don't penalise those that did for being transparent and for fulfilling their legal obligations. And also between countries, if you're doing cross-border stories, in some countries, the Freedom of Information Act is just not something that people take seriously at all. And other countries, they don't have any that's nearly as strong, so you can't challenge. I mean, it's not great in the UK, but the amount of data that I can get hold of in the UK compared to some of my colleagues, I mean, there's a lot of data, but I do find that things are categorized in ways that perhaps aren't as clear as they should be. So I'll get very excited when I found I've got lots and lots of data sets, and then I'll look and I'll think, what does that mean? And what does that mean? And how does that relate to that? So having the data doesn't always make your life easy. But again, if you're comparing across different countries, it can make it quite tricky. And it can also mean that the figures, again, are lower than they would have been if everybody was included. So I'm just going back to this particular story. And for this one, yeah, in terms of where we get our data, very often we will get it from the governments themselves. So something on, let me think of what I used. Oh, I think the previous one, the gas projects, that was government data. So went straight to the government departments. Colleagues went to the EU and their national governments, and we found out it was pretty open. We could see pretty much what was there and what was going on. For the subsidies, that took a lot more working out, because again, it's that definition, it's that classification of what is a subsidy. An investment, it's slightly harder to be so obscure about, because money is going into a pipeline, money is going into a power station. Whereas a subsidy, it could be that not paying tax on kerosene, it could be fuel allowance, it could be a whole manner of things. It's really quite complex. And we were going to do this ourselves, but then we found out that an NGO, Global Energy Monitor, had actually done what we were going to do. So we asked if we could use their data, and they were very happy to work with us. And also we worked with an industry group. We found that they had data on gas infrastructure. So Global Energy Monitor were our chief, let's say partners, but in terms of working on and managing the data. And we worked together to figure out their methodology. They explained to us how they gathered their data, and we checked it. And we then mapped it according to gas investments to get something of a picture. And like I said, France is, my French colleague always laughs when I say freedom of information, because she says we're just not going to get anything. So it could be that there aren't many gas projects in France. That is entirely possible, because France is very big on nuclear, but it could just be that the data isn't there. So it's always important to explain this in the story, just so it's absolutely clear what your readers are looking at. And I think that's probably it for that. I would say when you're starting out your data, it's always important to have a think about what it is you're dealing with. I know it's very easy to just jump in and start looking for things, but be familiar with your data set, get to know it. What is it telling you? Is there a data dictionary? That's something that it's always worth asking for, because the data dictionary will be your guide. It would explain to you how things have been categorized. It would explain what this strange little allowance is. It will explain why this was different in 2016, and even just the strange codes along the top. So it will give you an idea of what it is you're looking at and how to deal with it. And then if you're looking across data sets from public bodies, councils, regions that have different ways of doing it, you've got to find some kind of common ground. So think about what it is you want to say and what parts of it you agree on. So for our gas story, our low numbers were the bits we could pretty much agree on. So it was the tax breaks, and it was money, government money going to certain projects, that you knew these were subsidies, and anything that was kind of grey or didn't appear across the whole board, we tended to leave out. So that's why the figure is so much lower. Okay, I've got another case study, but I wonder if there's any questions in the chat before we go to that, because I go into a bit more detail about the process and working out a methodology.
There is one about if you to elaborate on the FOI, I think it's probably relevant here.
Yeah, so
yeah.
Let me just.
Sorry, can you see it, Juliet?
Yes, I can. I'm just, yeah. The current harm to it. Oh, yeah. Could you just maybe explain who asked the question, what it is that you're asking, just so for the rest of the group. Yes, thank you.
Oh, hello. I'm
Hi.
Dorothy Grace Elder. I'm in Scotland. Can you hear me? Thank you. We are an intensely secretive country, I'm afraid to say. Now and indeed in the past, before devolution, but we're still intensively secretive. The harm to FY is very, very dangerous. It's happening now. But I just wanted to find out from English colleagues if you're suffering the same. For instance, now in Scotland, and this changed about 2 years ago, the people handling your whole case throughout when you put in your applications are the people from a certain department, right? Now that's always happened. This department knows more about it than anybody else. But in the past, it was an FOI dedicated handler. They went to a department and they asked them, give me info on this, right? And then they made the decision, the FOI dedicated person. Now the stuff is handed to the department you're dealing with. And in most cases, I have good reason not to trust these departments I'm dealing with. And they make the decisions. So Jerry, the public mouse, is handed to Tom, the cat, who is put in charge of Jerry's future, which you can imagine what that could be. So you get stuff turned down, and then I have to do an appeal, which of course takes another 5 months till you get a result. I've won these, but it's a poor win. Do you have that in English?
Yes, we do.
Yes.
I've not done so many FOIAs
Right.
in the UK recently. I've been doing a lot to the EU, but I work very closely with colleagues, particularly at Open Democracy, and they have been challenging a lot, and they have found exactly the same thing. And some of it is a valid reason that delays were due to COVID. A year ago, yes, you could have said that, but how much longer can you keep saying this and keep putting off? I mean, the EU, they do tend to reply very well. They are better replying to the EU. But what other colleagues have found is that they'll do the opposite, that they'll actually drown you in information. So rather than saying there's this piece of information you wanted, they'll just go, there you go. And like, what can
I've not found the EU bad. In fact, I took a very difficult case to them and they were excellent. But that's maybe pot luck. But in an ordinary sense with the British Isles, I wonder if you also have the anonymising of which department stuff is coming from. Because we now, on the emails I get, total anonymisation. In other words, it's redacted to redacted and CC to redacted, redacted.
I haven't had that, but I'm guessing it's just a question of time. I mean, the freedom of information, governments regretted it the minute that they did it. I mean, there's a quote in Tony Blair's book where he describes himself as a nincompoop for ever having done it. And I think if anything encapsulates the government's view towards freedom of information, that does perfectly. And ever since, it's been trying to roll it back and roll it back. Yes. So
can't we all get
thank you. Sorry, can I just intervene here? Sorry, thank you so much, Dorothy, for your question, but I'm just conscious of time, and I just wondered if there is another question about the FOI, but I wondered if it's worth finishing your presentation.
No, it's okay. I'm happy to do this because I think this bit relates a bit more to the gathering data, and then we've got the methodology. So you don't address it to the press officer. You make very clear that it's a freedom of information request and you want it to be treated under the Freedom of Information Act. So I'm sorry, in response to the question in the chat. So there is a template that you can get off the Information Commissioner's Office's website, or Request Initiative. I believe that they're still going. Anybody that, sorry, just getting a bit of the question. It goes via them. Well, I mean, again, I think you have to, it's not a press request, it's freedom of information, and it should be treated as such. So it's not one for the press, and it should be challenged. And if you find that it's being treated as a press request rather than a FOIA, you should absolutely challenge that. That seems to be another route that they're taking to block. So, and if they keep doing it and won't take it seriously, then you take it to the Information Commissioner's office and ask them to sort it out, because they absolutely should be treating it as a FOIA. So I will move on to a case study, and I hope my screen will be able to share, because I've got some spreadsheets and I want you to talk a little bit about the methodology. Yes, Heather Brooke does. It's always worth reading what Heather Brooke's done, but there's a lot of stuff online as well, if you want advice on freedom of information. And it is important because this is how we get the interesting data. I mean, there are some, I don't know if anyone follows the work the Good Law Project are doing, but in terms of PPE contracts and government accountability and where money's gone, they're doing a lot of good work challenging through the courts the withholding of information. So there are people that are challenging, and it is worth taking a look. But I will go back to, so during the COVID, because we're a cooperative and because we're not a newsroom, we can't follow the news as it's happening. So we wanted to look into something COVID related, and this was at the very beginning of the pandemic. We could see the money that was going to vaccines, and a lot of it was public money, and that was fine. It should be public money if it's a public health crisis. But then wondering how much the pharmaceuticals are actually going to be making out of this, how much, how the vaccine would be shared, how fairly it would be distributed. So this was something we'd been looking at from the beginning. And we found, surprise, surprise, that it was, of course, the rich countries that were buying up the vaccine. Now, I will go through the methodology of this because it's quite a simple investigation, and I hope it's a good one to show you what we did. And also for this one, I think partly because I found an error in the data that I wasn't sure if it was my error or their error, I actually did write out a full methodology for it, which I've never done before. And now I'm so glad, because I always tell my students to do this, to write what you do, because it's your first inclination when you get a data set is that you jump in and you think, oh, where's the story? What's happening? Who's spending the most? Who's spending the least? And then if you find something and want to replicate it, you can't always remember how you did that. Because this was a simple data set, and because there was an outlier, but that both myself and my colleague were puzzling over, I did go through it all again and explain how I did it. And I can't share the Word document, but that's fine because I can do it from memory. So it wasn't our data set. It was the data set. If I put on the, so I just keep move the bar around. Okay, it was, I forget where the data set came from, though I did put that in my. So yeah, I was very good in my methods. And can you see what are you seeing now? Are you seeing the Word document, or are you still on the?
No, we're seeing the Excel documents.
Fine. Okay, that's fine. So I can't share the Word document, but it was not so important because I can go through the methodology that I actually did write down. So the data source was the Duke Global Health Innovation Centre. And we found that they'd collected data as to which of the countries were buying up the most of the vaccine. And because we don't like to use just the one source unless we can double check it elsewhere, also found a second data set from Global Justice. And they said it was from publicly available sources. We couldn't trace those sources, but we looked at both of the data sets and they were roughly the same. So we thought, given where they've come from, we trusted enough to go with this particular data set. And I can go back. So this was the data set that you can see on the screen that we used. Now, it shows per head of population. No, it doesn't. That's what we had to calculate. It shows how much vaccine each country had bought. Now, I don't want to go into how to use Excel because I'm happy to share the methodology, given I took the trouble to write it all down, and it kind of guides you through what I did. But what we wanted to see was, well, where the vaccines are going, who's bought the most, and is it what we expect, that it's mainly the rich countries? So this particular data set that I used, it was done by types of vaccine. So the first thing to do was to merge it by country, because I wasn't that particularly interested if it was Oxford or Novavax or Johnson. I just wanted to know the number overall for each of the country. I did that with a pivot table, and using World Bank data, I then calculated what that would be per head of population. So it initially came out that India was the top of the list, but of course there's a lot more people in India, so you would expect the Indian government to buy more. So to give a more accurate figure, I took data from the World Bank and calculated it by numbers of the population. And we found out that it was Canada that was buying the most, so that there was no great surprise there. But what did stand out and was a bit of a puzzle was that sitting between Japan and India was Nepal. And both my colleague and I that had worked on this story, we're reasonably familiar with Nepal, and it surprised us why this should be the case. And we were trying to think, well, maybe, I don't know, a very foresighted government department decided to put money this way, or perhaps money came from, and we were thinking of all these complicated reasons why it could be. Didn't come up with anything. And then I went back, thought maybe it's a mistake in my calculations. That's why I wrote the methodology. Still couldn't figure it out. Went to another colleague and said, look, could you just check this for me? Can you just see what's going on? And I will show you, because you can put on a filter. And this is something that's always worth thinking about with data. If something seems wrong, it probably is. So what she did, she got rid of everything else, found Nepal, and found that there were 2 entries. It was just a duplicate. It was an error. So for all our rationalizing and thinking it would be this, it was a mistake in the data. So that's one thing to always be aware of. There's always mistakes in data. It always needs cleaning. Data entry by its nature, it's very laborious, it's very boring, it's easy to get distracted. So whenever you're looking at a data set, once you know that it's useful for you, that it's something that you are going to be using as part of your story, it always needs cleaning up. And if there's something that seems wrong, don't question your own calculations. I mean, do obviously check them, but go back even further than that. It might be somebody else's mistake. So for all our puzzling, it was just a simple data error, which is why I think that was a nice one to include. And now I've lost where I am. So I'll stop sharing. Yeah, the result of that was that we had a more accurate chart than some of the other people that published that table that I won't name and shame, but let's say not everybody checked their data for that. Yeah, I mean, I've got a little bit more just in terms of data sources that I use quite regularly. I didn't want to load you down with links because you tend to find stuff as you need them. But good places to get data, World Bank is always useful, World Health Organization. The EU is good. There's a lot, once you start digging, much more than perhaps you would expect. And there's a few at the end that I just put. Marine traffic, that's quite a nice one to look at to see where boats are going. Flights and sharks is always a fun one. And a lot is published on government. I'm not sharing, am I? Sorry. So yeah, there's the links that I'm happy to share with you. It's not always as complicated as freedom of information requests and trying to figure out how things are categorized. Sometimes you can just look on these links and a story jumps out straight away. So it's the Information Commissioner's Office, and they publish all credit card payments over £500. And an eagle-eyed journalist was looking through this to see if there was anything there of interest, and noticed that just before Christmas, £6,248 had been spent at Hotel Cholera, which does seem like quite a lot in a chocolate shop for a government department. So that was their story that they wrote on it, and there was an investigation after that, and it was found to be Christmas presents for all of the staff. But yeah, it's a large sum to jump out on a spreadsheet, and the fact they had to do an investigation into it is a quite interesting one as well. You'd think that they would actually know where their money had gone, and for that reason. So you can find stories, and I mean, I have colleagues that will check of a Friday evening new data that's released, and you can often see things quite quickly. It's not all about complex. Sometimes it's just there for the looking. Often things are published quietly that you think, oh, if they're there, nobody will look, and therefore we can say we published it, and we're right, but nobody looked at it, so nobody finds the stories. And I'm just going to finish, which I won't go into details about these, other than to say these are the tools that I use the most. Obviously, you need a spreadsheet. It doesn't have to be Excel. Google Sheets works pretty well. Tabular, I don't know if you're familiar with that, but that has been an absolute lifesaver. It will convert PDFs to spreadsheets. It's free. You just upload your document and you're away. If it doesn't work for whatever reason, perhaps the JPEG or something that needs a little bit more effort, then Abby Fine Reader. There is a small charge for that, but it's really, really worth it. I came across that. I was looking at data sets, mining receipts for mines in DR Congo, and some were scanned and they were JPEGs, and I could just see like a whole month disappearing with trying to copy them over into a spreadsheet. And it was actually one of my students said, have you tried this? And I did, and it just saved me days of work. So I couldn't recommend that one enough if you've got JPEGs and particularly nasty data. Data wrapper, that was what we used for the bar chart, which I didn't show you because I couldn't flip over, but we know what a bar chart looks like. It's a simple way of visualizing data. Again, it's free. It's quite a straightforward one. You upload your data. It gives you a few options about how to display it. Draftable is one that I've just come across. A colleague shared it, and it's a way of comparing documents. And this can be particularly useful if documents have either been amended, or you suspect that they've been amended, or want to see what changes have been, or even if they're being completely blatant about it. You've got a lobbying position and a policy. You can put the two documents side by side and it will highlight the similarities or the differences. So that's a really useful tool. And finally, once you've grown out of Excel, or if you want to try your hand at some programming, then I would suggest R as a way of dipping your toe into the water there. It's another free way another free package way of managing data. The difference, I would say, Excel is a good introduction. Spreadsheets, I should not say Excel all the time, but spreadsheets are a good way of just finding your way around data, a good way of filtering, pivoting. Said I'm happy to share the methodology for the vaccines because that gives you quite a basic intro. But if you've got a large data set, or you're going to be asking the same query and want to save time in the long run, then RStudio, you program to bring the answers to you. A spreadsheet, you have to go and get them yourself and you look at them. Whereas something like R, you write your code and it will get you the answers. And the time-saving element of that is that your code can be adapted very, very easily. So once it's written, you can put the same query onto a different data set, or you can tweak it and make different changes. The tricky part is getting to grips with R, because whereas Excel, you open the spreadsheet and you're away pretty much, it does take some time to get up to speed with R, and you know that it's going to take you longer initially because anything that's unfamiliar will take time, but it is worth the investment. So few links, happy to share the slides and the presentation. And yeah, any questions? And if you want me to go into any more detail about any of the investigations, Investigate Europe we've worked on, happy to go back to any of those. I see there's one in the chat already. I said still on FOIAs. I see, I nearly put something on FOIAs here, and then I thought, no, it's data. But FOIAs are really important because this is how we get the information. And I've got a few going through at the moment with the EU, because the current EU Ombudswoman is very much in favour of greater transparency, particularly when it comes to revolving doors. We're just looking for a case that we can use to challenge this. Too time consuming and they can't respond. How do you deal with that? Okay, what you can, if you think it really is too time consuming. Like if you've asked for everything for the last 5 years, then be a little bit more specific as to what you want, maybe narrow the time frame. So think more carefully and more precisely. Can you, do you think the last 3 months, do you think the last 6 months, they probably possibly are being reasonable. What you shouldn't do is what you've said, and that's break it down further and send multiple requests, because if they see that it's come from the same person, they'll put them together as one. So you'll waste a lot of time there. So think more, because you can always do one later. So if you think, okay, I'll go for the last 3 months and maybe I'll just ask for meeting minutes and agendas and not emails this time, because I suspect there might be quite a lot, or I'll just ask between this organisation. So think about how you can narrow it down further, and you can then follow it up. I mean, it obviously is taking more time, but at least you'll be getting something, and then you can be more precise in future requests, but don't break them down, because they'll just lump them all together again, and you'll save nothing. Yeah, what else? I was going to say something else and it's gone. I don't know if I'm 31st of March. Oh no, I'm not going to be there. I've got something else in March. No, I won't be at the conference. So Abby Fine Reader converts scans of JPEGs. Yes, it does. You have to pay for it, but it's not very much. It's just the price of a couple of coffees in terms of the time it saves. The only thing with Abby Fine Reader, as with a lot of these tools, is that for the cheaper versions, you're uploading them online. So just keep in mind you are giving them to this company. I work with publicly available data, so I don't really care. It's there anyway, so I don't have any secrets. But if I did have secrets, if it was something that a whistleblower had given to me, then I wouldn't put them through any kind of app like that. You can pay a bit more with Abby Fine Reader and get an offline version that might be worth doing. But yes, for Companies House, it worked really well with some really ugly JPEGs that I had. So yeah, you should be good with that. And it really got me out of a hole, I can tell you, because I could just see months going with this. So that was a good tool. So yeah, we've still got 10 minutes. So more questions, as I'll find something else to talk about.
I'm not sure whether you wanted to give there's a mix, I think it's a mixed group of people who are doing data journalism already, but there might be some people who are quite new to it. So I want to give, maybe 3 top tips to, to delve into it, how to get.
Yeah, I think it can be a little bit daunting, which is why I always like to show the examples that predate computers, that it's just a way of gathering information and making sense of the world. So I would probably just find yourself a data set. I mean, it can be something that somebody else has already made a story out of. We've probably got some on the Investigate Europe website. I'm sure the Guardian would have some, the FT. Just find a data set and see what's going on. You can set up filters along the top. The things that you need to use in Excel, there's probably only about 7 things that you need to do. So if you are looking at a training course, do one specifically for journalists. You could probably figure it out without that, because I think now there's just so much on Excel at the very basic level, videos, YouTube, that you could probably just figure it out. The functions that I use the most are the filtering and the pivot tables. They are super helpful. And pivot tables, they aggregate the data. They let you look at it in a different way. So from the data set that I showed you with the vaccines, it was done by country, but it was also done by vaccine type. So Nepal would have been in there for as many different vaccines as it was only the 2 entries. But I don't care if it's Oxford, I don't care if it's Moderna, I just want you to know what the overall total was. And using the pivot table allowed me to do that. So look up filtering, look up pivot tables, and look up basic calculations. And I think there should be enough tutorials for you online to be able to figure that. And I've also got a helpful, handy hint Excel spreadsheet guide, a 2-page guide that I'm very happy to share. You don't need to do anything complicated. Likewise with programming, that I would recommend that you get somebody to train you in that rather than jump straight in. But any program training you do it for journalists, because otherwise you will find you're taught from a programming perspective, and most of which you will never need to know, and it will just confuse you completely. I remember I once did a day course in Python because I thought that might be quite useful to learn, and after a day I could write my name backwards, and I just thought, I'm never going to get the hang of this. Whereas with R, it's a former journalist that teaches, so he only teaches us what we need to know, those basic commands and how to get your way around a big data set so that you can find out what's going on. But you don't even need Excel, you can use Google Sheets. It's slightly different, but that's the same kind of functionality. So yeah, I'm happy to share my tips sheet. It's for Excel, so it's slightly different in Google Sheets, but it's the same principle. It's the same kind of thing. But yeah, see what other people have done. And as I said, good sites will share their data sets as well. So you can just jump in and have a look and see what's on government websites, see what's there. I mean, something like the Hotel Cholera, that was easy to find. Just find a data set and have a look. I mean, that's a small one that jumps out. You don't need any special skills for that. So yeah, jump in. Yes.
I wonder if any of you have contacted the statistics regulator for Britain sometimes. I tend not to completely trust any regulator on anything, but I found that he was actually decent. In fact, on one outrageous example of statistics twisting in Edinburgh, he and his team came up from London and investigated it.
Oh, that's really good to know.
Yeah, he did. And he did sort them out. And I've had to bring them back in again on something else because they're always at it. As soon as you manage to score any point and get any wrong removed, they come back in with something else. One of the main reasons is that all governments and all local authorities have too many so-called officials and we PRs running around. There's far more of these, I'm quite sure, if we checked it for the whole of Britain, than there are writing journalists or people like
us. I think you're probably right. Yeah.
That would be so valuable.
Yeah.
Because we are being done down. I mean, we know locally that the government is far more PRs than the BBC in Scotland has journalists. That's no surprise to me. I think that would be a very minimum look at the dreadful situation. These people are scratching around for something to do to please their masters.
And I think the point raised earlier about why does it go to a PR rather than the freedom of information, because it's reputational damage. It's immediately thinking, what should we be hiding? What do they want to know that we don't want them to know?
They will hide here, knee-jerk, for the sake of hiding.
Yeah, even if there's nothing to hide. Yes. You know, even if it might be just completely innocent, and all we maybe want to see is, I don't know, what measures have been taken to, I don't know, reduce road traffic accidents. That's a good thing.
They would hide that also because it's knee-jerk. Do not tell the public anything. And FOI, unfortunately, overall FOI support has not altered that. Now, it kicked in here in 2005, and since then, at first it was, and it is a valuable thing, but government after government in Edinburgh have diluted that and diluted it until now. I think you could bet that these PR type people and SPADs and so on, they will always spy on it. They will be handed it by the people that you're dealing with anyway. Whether or not you try to stop them doing that, they will do that. So what I think we must do is complain to the Freedom of Information.
You're right. You absolutely should challenge.
Time.
I feel it's a great conversation, but I can see we're running out of time.
Sorry.
Leave enough space to say thank you so much, Juliet, for a very informative session. I can already see an FOI session would probably work.
Yeah, I think you do. I think, yeah, I've got a colleague that she's the queen of the foyer, especially in the UK. So well, yeah.
And I just wanted to say thank you. It's lovely to see so many people online. What I will say is that if anyone isn't a member of Women in Journalism, please could you sign up. It's a great organisation and it delivers many benefits. There are events coming up, there are more masterclasses like this, but also there's the opportunity for mentoring and that sort of thing. But what's really exciting is as we recover from COVID, increasingly we'll start to do face-to-face sessions, but we will be keeping online events as well, because I think it's a really good way of bringing the whole of the country together. It's lovely to see a colleague in Scotland and be able to have these conversations. So thank you, everyone. And once again, thank you again, Juliet. It was great.
Thank you, everyone. Thanks for your questions.
Thank you.